Hey folks, welcome. Commence the Washington County Public Affairs Forum. Thanks for joining us at Ernesto's. And for those of you who are here, you were able to read and read an email and listen to directions. I fear that we're going to have a lot of people who are reading the note that I posted on the Pepper Mills door stating, "We've moved today." So this is the second to the last forum that we're going to have this season. We have one more starting June 2nd, our forum season ends June 2nd, and that'll be again at the Pepper Mill. And that's our annual meeting where we'll announce the slate of officers for the 2014-2015 forum season. So what I'd like to do is introduce Professor Jim Moore from Pacific University, who will encore with us in 2 weeks at the Pepper Mill. And today he's going to do election predictions. So what I'd like to ask you to do is please put your hands together for Professor Jim Moore.
Well, it's good to be with you. I was counting, this may be the 5th or 6th different place that I've met with you over the past 20 years. So there you go. So we're going to do predictions today and trends that we're seeing in the election as it's coming together. And then 2 weeks from now, you guys are going to do all your officers, and then we're going to figure out what the heck happened. And more importantly, as we're going to get into today a little bit, we'll be looking towards the fall, when the real election is going to be taking place. Starting statewide, we have basically one election, and that's the Republican Senate primary that's going on right now. This is a fascinating one because nationally, a lot of people have decided Jeff Merkley is very vulnerable. And nationally, a lot of people have decided that Monica Webby is incredibly electable, and no one's really consulted with the Oregon electorate on any of this. And so we're going to see what happens with this. So to Jeff Merkley, we'll hit him in 2 weeks as well. There's been polling, not very good polling. The number of people they talk to is rather small. But the idea is that because of Obamacare, Jeff Merkley is going to be vulnerable, and his approval ratings aren't as high as they ought to be, and so that makes him, boy, you know, we ought to put him in the category of he might lose, and certainly he might lose. However, not for any of those reasons. We have no idea if health care is going to be the main issue in the fall. I mean, we simply don't have any idea. My guess is that in the fall, it's going to be economy, just as it has been every election since 2008. If Jeff Merkley is to lose, it will be something like the reason that caused Jeff Merkley to win, something completely out of his control, and there will be a big movement in terms of how people understand what the election is doing, what Republicans are doing, what Democrats are doing. You may recall that 6 years ago, Jeff Merkley was a consistent 4 points behind Gordon Smith. And then the economy went in the dumper, and Jeff Merkley was a consistent 4 points ahead of Gordon Smith. Through nothing that Jeff Merkley did, but just because the conversation completely changed. And so that certainly might happen, but it's nothing to plan on at this point. So let's go and look at our senatorial candidates, Jason Conger and Monica Webby. We don't know who's going to win. If you were to count everything we can measure, how much money they've raised, the ads, all those kinds of things, it looks like it's going to be Monica Webby, but there's been no good polling about what's actually going on in the electorate. We don't know if it's going to be the electorate that sometimes turns up in Republican primaries. This is the modern electorate. This is the electorate 4 years ago that chose Chris Dudley to be the gubernatorial candidate. This is the electorate 8 years ago that chose Ron Saxon to be the gubernatorial candidate. We don't know if it's going to be that electorate or if it's going to be the more conservative electorate that's going to show up, and that's the electorate that chose Bill Sizemore, that loves Kevin Mannix, that, you know, all those kinds of things. We just have no idea who's going to actually vote. Looking at the returns, the ballot returns from around the state, we can't tell either. They're pretty much even. There's no part of the state that's kind of jumping out with ballot returns at this point. And so we have no idea. If I had to guess, I'd say that Webby's going to win, but it's totally a seat of the pants guess at this point. Webby has had a campaign that has hit a couple of road bumps in the last 10 days. Road bump number one of her Patience has been charged by Multnomah County with child abuse because this woman has lots of children and she's ordered surgeries for them and medical treatments for them that are seen to be as unnecessary. Monica Webby has performed 10 of those surgeries. And so this raises questions about the center of Webby's campaign, which is, I'm a doctor, trust me. It raises questions about judgment. Conger can't do anything about that because Conger has no money to run a campaign. In fact, just today, going to Forest Grove to here, I saw my very first 2 Conger lawn signs. 2. That's it. So he has no money to do anything. And then the second thing is the release of the tape from last week, where Monica Webby's old boyfriend called the police and said she's stalking me, and so that kind of blew up. You know, all good fun. Is it going to change anything? We don't know. The guess is that the tape, the stalking accusation, goes nowhere, and the reason is we have vote by mail. At this point, at least 60% of all the voters have already cast their ballots. And so the remaining is just not going to be enough to move things. If she's, for instance, ahead by 17 points, it may mean that it shifts it so that she wins by 10 points or something like that. But not enough to really change things. So you know, we're just kind of on pins and needles waiting to see what actually happens. We'll talk in 2 weeks about really what has to happen for the Republican to win. Remember, we haven't had a Republican victory in the state in a decade plus. And so it's an uphill battle. It's an uphill battle for a Republican in Oregon right now. A couple of things about the turnout at this point. Turnout, and this is as of Thursday night, that's the last, as when I looked this morning, the last that they had on the Secretary of State site. As of Thursday night, we were heading towards probably a 38 to 41% turnout across the state. Exactly the same pattern we've seen in other primary elections where that ends up what's happening. One thing that I look for is, so which party is more organized, more enthused, who's turning out? And I would expect it to be the Republicans because they've got a primary for the U.S. Senate. And that's not the case at all. As of Thursday night, we had 20.6% of Democrats had voted across the state and 21% of Republicans had voted across the state, basically the same. And so that tells me that the campaign for the U.S. Senate is not catching people's attention. It's not driving voter turnout. It's just not moving as you would expect to see a successful campaign. Next week, or 2 weeks from now, we'll also talk about the governor's race in more detail. But a quick thing on that, at this point, 4 years ago, John Kitzhaber, who was not the incumbent, he was the incumbent from before, but so he was running. We got the first polling right about now and just after the election that showed that it was basically a dead heat between him and Chris Dudley. At this point, the polling shows that not just that Kitzhaber is ahead, but that Dennis Richardson is way below where he ought to be. 2 years ago, 2012, we had what we in social science love. It's called the natural experiment. Ooh, what does that mean? We had no Republicans who ran in the primary for the Attorney General's office or for the Treasurer's office. And so we had write-in candidates who then ran pretty lackluster campaigns in the fall. And so the natural experiment is, so what is the natural level for Republican voters in the state? And both of those candidates got about 40% of the vote. Dennis Richardson's polling shows that at best, he's at about 40% of the vote right now. And so that's a lot for him to overcome. And we'll see if he can do it. But right now, it doesn't look good for Kitzhaber losing or for Richardson winning as we look at it at this point. Let's look at some of the primary races that we've got going around here. Here in Washington County, kind of the best thing is we have some lively county commission races. Did you have all of them here? Did they all come to talk to you guys? Yeah. Yeah, okay, so this is great. And it's fascinating to watch people respond to it. Some of them, because Elizabeth Furs is involved, that gets a little national attention because she was in Congress and trying to figure out what's going on with it. And so explaining to people what's going on, we have the incumbents who are being challenged but there's kind of the more conservative incumbents and the liberal incumbent, and the Oregonian likes all three of them, and how does that work? And so somebody asked me, so do you ever see people mixing and matching when they support these candidates? And I drive from District 2 into District 4 in Forest Grove every day, and I go past fields with signs in them, and I go through neighborhoods with signs in them. In my own neighborhood, there are signs up, and it's always a Dyke sign with a Terry sign. It's never a Dyke sign with a Furs sign, and it's always an Amabisca sign with a Furs sign. You never mix them. So it's pretty clear to people who's who and what they stand for. The District 2 race, where I actually live, where you look at Malinowski and Zarowski, which is also interesting to explain. We do not have a big Polish population, but apparently they're running for county commission. You know, there the campaign seems to be a little bit more muted, but when you look at it, you just never find a Malinowski sign with a Dyke sign. People are very clear on who they're supporting and how they're supporting them across the board. What's going to happen in that race? Once again, there's no polling going on out there. It's hard to tell where the ballots are coming from within the county itself. However, there's something that we political analysts do, which I discovered is kind of legitimate, and I discovered this from Vic Attia. Vic Attia has asked me to write his biography. So that's a project that I'm working on for the next several years, and it is a hoot. It's really, really a fun project. And so talking to Vic, who served in the legislature for 20 years, he lost one gubernatorial race and then he won 2 gubernatorial races. He said in all of those elections, primaries and generals, there was only one election when he didn't know if he was going to win or lose. Just one. And it wasn't because he spent money on polling or anything. It's just the sense he had from talking to people and seeing what was out in the district and those kinds of things. The one election where he simply didn't know what was going to happen, he drove to his victory party thinking he was losing, and then he heard something on the news that said he was behind, but behind by less than he thought, and he said, oh, we're actually going to win. So it was that close for him to figure it out. My sense is that the incumbents win this in Washington County. And the main reason is that the opponents, especially Amabisca and Furs, they've got an issue. And the issue is land use, and the issue is Helvetia, and that actually makes a difference in part of the county, but District 4 is so big that it doesn't resonate through the entire district. And when you look at the entire county, looking at the chair's race, when you get to people in Tigard and all those other kinds of places, in the middle of Beaverton where we are, it doesn't resonate that much at all. And so I think that the incumbents are going to win here. We'll see. We'll see, because it's a much livelier campaign than I thought it was going to be. Remember, this campaign was going to start out very differently. I don't know how many people got the call that I did from a polling firm. They were floating, if Ben Unger were to run for the county chair, would you support him? If David Edwards were to run for the county chair, would you support him? And clearly the polling said no, because they didn't run. And so we end up with the Helvetia crowd, which is great. They've got a lot of ideas. It makes it very interesting. But my sense is that the incumbents are going to pull this out. But once again, this is totally seat of the pants. Totally seat of the pants. There's no hard numbers on this whatsoever. The other big one in the county is the House District 34 for the Democrats. This is actually my House district. And so we've got 3 people running. It's fascinating because 2 of them have lots of money. 2 of them have raised well over $100,000. One has, as of the last time I checked, had raised almost $4,600. The Oregonian, of course, endorsed him. And so the 2 who spent a lot of money are out there. And so my wife is a registered Democrat. I'm an unaffiliated voter. My wife is a registered Democrat. And so she gets all the mailings. You can't tell the difference between the candidates at all from their mailings. They're the same color. They're the same pictures. There was one week when we got on one side of the mailers from both of them, women who said, boy, I really trust this person. One was a little older than the other, that was the difference. And so if you go by that, and then you go by the voters pamphlet, how are you supposed to make a choice here? How are you supposed to make a choice? So one of them's going to win. I can guarantee that. But beyond that, it's hard to see what this is going to say about the district because the candidates kind of blend together. They kind of blend together. We don't have it in Washington County, but there are 3 districts across the state, Republican districts, where they actually have very clear differences. There are in effect Tea Party type people running against incumbents or people who've been chosen by the incumbent to succeed them. I'll talk about those in just a bit because they're fascinating to look at. But we just don't have that in Washington County. We're not seeing that clarity as we look at things. The other big issue that's on the ballot for many people in Washington County is, of course, the Beaverton school bond. You know, leave it to Beaverton to say, well, soon we will surpass Portland in population. No, I guess we won't, but we got a big school district, and so we're going to put on a single bond that's 50% bigger than the biggest bond Portland has ever put on. And there are really good reasons for that. It combines bonds in terms of the way that it's going to phase in. You don't have to go to the voters as often, blah, blah, blah. There's all these great things, but that number is huge. It's just huge. And so we don't, this is where I was looking at what the Republican versus Democratic turnout is. If it's more of a Republican turnout, there's going to be more of an anti-tax edge to the voters. If there's more of a Democratic turnout, there will be, it's not so much that it's an anti-tax edge versus a pro-tax edge, but it's going to be a pro-school kind of electorate. And lo and behold, in Washington County, you can't really tell. You can't really tell at this point. And so that school bond is going to be really, really important. The Oregonian was fascinating on this. They said the number is right, but the way you did it is all wrong. And so what you ought to do is not have this election, but we're already having this election, and you ought to put a chunk of it on the November ballot and then another chunk in about 2 or 3 years to make sure people will support on what you're doing, which is the Oregonian editorial board, I think, went a little nuts on this. That's a little too much detail in whether you support this or not, but off they go. I bring the Oregonian up because the Oregonian, of course, has been the major news source for a long time. And this year, with the changes in the Oregonian, we're seeing a shift in that. There's nothing to replace it, however. And so we're watching the Oregonian, and I'm sure we have many people in here who subscribe to the Oregonian. My wife hates it that she has to go into the computer 3 days a week and read the comics and try to figure out what's going on. I read it on my little iPad, and you know, boy, getting that thing big enough to read is kind of interesting. But so there's a shift going on, and just anecdotally, I've talked to lots of people who are saying, this is it, I'm just going to stop reading it. But there's nothing to replace it yet. The closest that we have is actually very interesting. It's become OPB. OPB is doing a pretty good job of covering the state and covering politics in the state, but they're in all sorts of different directions as they do that. It's environmental things here. It's you know, interesting stories about people who've done interesting things here. And so the politics is there, but it's not like the Oregonian when it used to have 10 or 12 reporters just focused basically on that. Just last week, we lost another Oregonian political reporter. Harry Estev is leaving the Oregonian to go to Portland State. Christian Gaston, who used to work at the Forest Grove News-Times, left in April. And so there's some really good people who are leaving, and it's like the Oregonian isn't replacing them in a number that makes sense. Then you go to the editorial board. The editorial board, which has been listened to less and less and less over time, and that's not an Oregonian thing, that's across the country. People are paying less and less attention to media endorsements in campaigns. But the editorial board always responds to what its own reporters have done. And now they're going to have less and less and less to respond to. And so we'll see what happens with that. I'm not hopeful at this point that their model is going to work. And for politics, it makes a big difference. It makes a big difference. The paper of record is changing, and the political system in the United States for the past 100+ years has been that there is this media center and the politicians want to get free coverage through it, and that's who you look to for leadership, or to hate them, whatever it is. But you look to that media center, and that's changing, and we just don't know what's going to replace it. If we become fractured so that we're in effect like the cable news cycles that are all across the country, we just don't have enough population for that. And so figuring out where that center is and where the coverage is going to come from is going to be really, really tough to figure out. Here's an interesting set of facts about the primaries for the state legislature in Washington County. If you count the number of Senate districts that hit the county that have elections this year, there are 4 of them. 3 of them have a Republican and a Democrat, and 1 just has a Democrat. So if Betsy Johnson wins with no opponents, she's in. If you look at the House districts, we have 12 state representatives that hit Washington County somehow. Of those, 6 will have no opponents in the fall. So if they're elected in the primary, they're elected. Betsy Johnson's a Democrat. Some would argue with that. Betsy Johnson's a Democrat. The other 6 that have no opponent in the fall are all Democrats as well. Actually 5 that have no opponents, and there's 34 where there's no Republican, so whichever of the 3 wins in District 34 wins. So I've been talking to you for 20 years or so. You may recall 20 years ago was the Republican Revolution. It hit here in Washington County. It was when Newt Gingrich came to power in Congress. It's when we looked at Oregon having, for the first time in decades, having the Republicans control both houses of the legislature. Washington County was kind of the center of that. It's shifted now. We're looking like Multnomah County. We're looking like this is a safe place for Democrats. Republicans won't even run in half of the seats that come up into the county. We're looking a lot more like Multnomah County. That may be a factor of the size of the county, because we're growing quickly, and we will surpass Multnomah County within the next 15, 20 years. It may be the people who are moving in. It may be those, we've talked a lot here and with several of you individually. The Republicans are not as good as they used to be at creating a farm team, training good candidates to come in. But whatever it is, Washington County is looking a lot bluer than it has in a long time. And so just keep that in mind as you're kind of looking at your ballot and deciding what you want to do. Let's quickly talk about the Republicans who are around the state. We've got Republican incumbents in House 18, so Vic Gilliam, Jim Thompson in House 23. Both of them are being challenged from the right by Tea Party-ish type people, funding Washington County FAC and Monica Webby FAC. Andrew Miller of Simpson Lumber gives them a lot of money. This is also where Lauren Parks has given money to the challengers. And then in State House 58, which is out basically Pendleton, this is Bob Jensen, who's retired after 16 years in the House. And so there's the person he chose, basically John Turner, who's served on the Umatilla Port Commission and all sorts of things like that. And then a Tea Party-ish challenger named Greg Barreto. Barreto has also gotten money from Lauren Parks. He's the guy who returned the money to Lauren Parks. He got $30,000, then he returned it, and then he loaned himself $30,000. In those races, there's some clear choices, and it looks like the national conversation. What's the Tea Party doing? What's the Republican conversation about? Where is the Republican Party going? Just to kind of do a little bit of prediction there, I think that the Tea Party challengers are going to lose in at least 2 of the 3 districts. Here's the one where I think that they might have a chance. That's in 23 against Jim Thompson. It's a guy named Mike Neerman, and the reason is just in the past 4 days, he has gotten $35,000 more from Oregon Right to Life and from the Oregon Family Council. So they've seen something that they think could win, and they're putting money into it. The other challengers have not gotten any money in the last week, 10 days. So that says to me, there could be change going on there. And that's just all within the Republican Party, just within the Republican Party. 20 years ago, we were having those kinds of conversations here. We're not anymore. We're not anymore. And if you look at House District 34, we can't even tell what the differences are within the Democratic Party. It's all the people who apparently love to go to playgrounds with their children and they have dogs. That's about it. And so there's a lot of good political conversations happening across the country, but we're not necessarily seeing that here. We would be seeing it a little bit more if Conger had more money, and if the Conger-Webby race was a more clearly delineated difference between what it means to be Republican and who might win in the fall. So with that, let's take some questions.
Just stand up and answer your question. We're not doing a microphone this time.
Jim, do you see anything on social media having any impact on the elections or the future of it?
At this point, we don't see social media playing a big role. I've talked about it with this group. It was about 10 years ago that every campaign needed to have a website. What did they do with the websites? Hardly anything, but they were there. And then we've seen the well-funded campaigns begin to develop a social media type of thing. And so the Merkley campaign did this, for instance. Gordon Smith actually did fairly well 6 years ago with social media as well. But you've got to have money to do it. And then here's the thing that's really the kicker on it. We haven't seen that it moves new voters. There's a real issue in political science when we kind of talk about these things. You get new things. And so somebody actually did a really nice study 30 years ago about the neighborhood associations in Portland. Neighborhood associations in Portland, it'll get people involved, people will buy into what's happening, all this kind of stuff. And then we said, okay, so what difference does it make in policy? There was none. What difference does it make in who participates? There was none. What these new things do, like social media, is they give people who would otherwise take part just a new way to take part. And so so far we haven't seen them move voters who would not otherwise vote, get them involved and get them to take part. Even the Obama move in 2008 and a little bit in 2012 did not really bring in that many new voters. There's a lot of stuff about the Obama campaign in 2008. It brought in a lot of youth. It did. People under the age of 30. However, even with the record numbers of under age 30 people voting, they were still hitting below their demographic weight with every other age group. So it brought in some extras, but they weren't even getting up to kind of the norm for people 31 to 40, 40 to 45, all that kind of stuff. So we're waiting for social media to make a big difference.
Another question, we've had some changes in the leadership in the Republican Party in the last couple of years, and I wonder if you could comment, is there a trend or what can we look for in the future?
So the state party?
The state party,
Yeah,
state Republican Party.
So here's the fun thing about being in the Republican Party, because there aren't any statewide elected officials, the chair matters. And we've seen that for the past 25 years, but especially with the Gordon Smith leaving, that the chair matters. So even among Democrats, if you ask them who's the chair of the state party, not many are going to know. Whereas among Republicans, people are going to have a tendency to know, and other people will also know. So we've got Art Robinson right now. So the pattern over the past 25 to 30 years has been, because the chair is chosen by the central committees, the central committees tend to be much more conservative than the Republican electorate. So they choose a chair who reflects those views. The problem is that chair, who's pure on whatever is the measurement of the season, is usually really awful at recruiting candidates and raising money. And so then that chair is replaced by somebody who can raise money, who's not as pure on whatever the flavor of the month is, and so we go back and forth. With Art Robinson, we've got somebody who is not that good at raising money. He's not that good at finding candidates, and he is simultaneously running again for Congress against Peter DeFazio. So the Republican Central Committee, the Republican leadership, is a bit adrift right now. It's a bit adrift right now. You may recall that before the latest round of who the Republican leadership was, we had Alan Alley, and he was there because he'd be the fundraising guy, and he's a nice guy, so he could recruit candidates. And he was more or less successful with that. How important is Alan Alley? People were still waiting for him to get into the governor's race as of the filing deadline at 5 o'clock. because people couldn't believe Dennis Richardson was it. And so the Republican Party, in a lot of ways, it depends on kind of a candidate to run things rather than the organization of the party itself. And that's just the way things are right now. So.
You'd mentioned the Richardson campaign. I understand from the newspaper that he's moving his campaign headquarters to Multnomah County or Clackamas County?
Yeah, he's moving up to the Portland area.
Okay.
The Portland area. Yeah, and so this is a guy from Central Point who apparently wants to figure out what it's like to be stuck in traffic. And it's not clear why, because when you look at the centers of Republican electorates around here, you can't even argue that Clackamas County is a center. While Republicans, or while Washington County trends Democratic in everything, Clackamas sometimes goes Republican, look at their county commission races, but it's only about a 3 or 4% difference. They're basically in lockstep with us, but a little bit less Democratic. And so he's moving up here basically so he can go do interviews on Think Out Loud more easily and that kind of stuff. Is it going to work? Probably not. Chris Dudley was a basketball star. He hadn't been a basketball star for quite some time, but at least, you know, he was the tall guy, you could recognize him. I don't think it's going to work for Dennis Richardson, but it's an interesting thing. One thing, it's not our county or anything like that. I don't know if anybody saw this, but in the 5th Congressional District, the Statesman Journal discovered last week that Tootie Smith, who's a current Clackamas County Commissioner, served in the legislature, does not live in the 5th Congressional District. The law, though, is based on federal law, because it's a federal office. You simply have to be a citizen of the state. And so she's running, and you know, rightfully she said, you know, my family's been on this farm forever and ever. They move the line is only a mile from my house, and those kinds of things. But she's someone who wouldn't move. She's someone who wouldn't move. So there was, yeah.
Jim, there seems to be an increasing attention to the issue of income inequality nationally. Seems to be getting some traction. Are you noticing anything, maybe you'd like to comment on that, and are you noticing anything in any state reasons pertaining to that particular
no, the income inequality issue I thought was going to be a big thing because Oregon, like Washington, has the highest state minimum wage in the country. They're a little bit ahead of us by like 3 cents or something. And so I thought, like Washington, where they had CTAC actually voted on raising the minimum wage up to whatever it was, $15 an hour, whatever they decided, I thought that would be something that would take off here. It hasn't. It hasn't. And so inequality is something, one of the, especially among Democratic groups, you talk to them, they say, yeah, but it's like social media. It doesn't necessarily bring new people into the conversation. And we aren't sure that it's going to be something that plays a big role in the fall election. It's hard to put a face on that unless you're arguing about what the minimum wage ought to be. Otherwise, it's really squishy. Remember, in a campaign, you want to put something on a bumper sticker. Inequality, because it leads to poorer outcomes. You lost your bumper sticker right there. So we haven't seen it here. Other places, it's usually hooked to the minimum wage argument. And there, it's become an issue all the way from Senate races down to state legislative races.
Jim, in the back, just a personal note, if you come to my house, you'll find an Andy Dyke and a Greg Malinowski.
Oh my gosh! I've got to take a picture of that.
The reason is, they both have been very supportive of libraries and library support from the general fund. The question, young people, are they registering in any way at all, or is this, I see it sort of declining participation year after year?
Yeah, no, so young people registration, no, there is no wave at this point. There's kind of the normal stuff. So I had, out at Pacific, I had a community forum with the county commission candidates, and it was the day before the deadline to register. And lo and behold, my students stood up and they had 200 registration forms they were going to turn in the next day. Fantastic, except that's kind of normal on a college campus. The big push was in 2008 in the primary when the Obama people registered 200,000 new young people. And we've seen that number kind of tail off. Because they're college students, they leave, you know, people, you know, change parties. A lot of the young people will not become Republicans, but they'll go and they'll become Pacific Green Party or, you know, those kinds of things. So we are not seeing a push. We're not seeing a push. The pattern over the past basically the post-World War II years, the pattern is that pushes come in presidential election years, not in the off years. And we just don't have any races that would generate that kind of thing right now. So.
The legislation or the bureaucrats have gutted PCA and TVCTV for funds for the independent producers. Is that possibly a way of the media getting the new candidates out before the public with public access? We all pay $1 for that every month.
Yeah, we all pay $1 for it, and you know, the whole public access model is being rethought. The thing with the public access, and it's not just here, it's across the country, is you have to be really a C-SPAN nerd to watch this stuff. And you know, there's lots of C-SPAN nerds in here. In fact, I just went to a memorial service for a family friend, and the last time I talked to him in detail was when he saw me on C-SPAN in the middle of the night. And he didn't have email, by God, he called at 2 in the morning. It's like, what are you doing? And so, yeah, there's free media. Yeah, it's being attacked by how it's controlled and what the money is and all those kinds of things. Is it making a difference? Not that we can see. A place to look at this is one of the Multnomah County Commission races has Loretta Smith, who's the incumbent. One for challengers is a guy named Bruce Broussard, who's got his own access show, and he's running as I'm the TV guy. It's kind of like in Washington County, whenever Lisa Michaels runs for anything, she says, I've got a TV show. Yeah? Who's seen this thing? So it's not making a big difference now. Where that does make a difference is if you've got the money in your campaign, you can take those snippets and you can turn it into an ad. There you go. There's something about the credibility of seeing something from another show put into an ad is better than just the candidate striding along saying, hi, I believe in goodness and apple pie. So it's not making a big difference politically at this point.
Jim, thank you. Do you have any comments on the King Beatty City Council race here in Beaverton?
Actually, I haven't been following that much. It's actually easier for me to do that because I live in Rock Creek and the Oregonian can't figure out where I live, so I get the Beaverton paper, which is fascinating. It's not my school district or anything, but there you go. But no, I haven't really been watching it that closely. It's certainly not like the good old days. One of the things we haven't talked about, it hasn't been a huge deal here except for Lauren Parks and Andrew Miller, outside money coming into campaigns. Remember the good old days when Phil Knight decided he wanted to buy part of the Beaverton City Council? And he totally failed, but he spent a lot of money. And so, boy, that was fun. We're not seeing that kind of dynamic.
I want to push back a little bit about social media in terms of the first race, as well as for the commission chair race. On my Facebook, for example, I see a ton of ads for both first and for Allen. And it remains to be seen whether that'll be effective or not, but they're doing a lot of advertising.
Yeah, and we're seeing that. I just, because of the Monica Webby thing, I've gotten several national interviews, and so I was looking on the Daily Beast to see when the story would come up. And boy, you know, John Kitzhaber pops up there. But we still haven't seen those kinds of things move voters. And that's the thing. When you look at Facebook, the Facebook crowd, it's not the kids anymore, because the kids, oh, the Facebook is so last week. And so it might be people who would actually vote, but we're not seeing that make a difference yet. If Elizabeth Furs wins this thing, then that's something we're going to look at really, really carefully. Because it's clearly not what she's saying in the public forums, and it's clearly not the advertising that she's doing out there in general. It's got to be something like that that's really catching people's mind. And so we'll see. We'll see. Yeah.
Yes, I'm a little bit, I'd like to go back to Clackamas County.
Oh, okay.
Because they have a little thing going on over there for their clerk, who's in trouble all the time. And I was wondering, do you have any, there's like 2 or 3 people who are running for that. Do you have any?
Yeah, Clackamas County, you know, it's not Washington County, so I didn't focus on it. But remember, Clackamas County on the commission, the conservative majority is actually endorsing candidates to replace the less conservatives on there. So there's a lot of that kind of infighting going on. Then the clerk, remember this is the clerk who had the person who was volunteering in her office who actually was throwing away votes, who didn't quite count right, didn't inform candidates about X, Y, and Z. It's an interesting clerkship. You know, looking at it, the campaign has not really focused on she's an incompetent, we just got to throw her out. It's more generic stuff, trust me. And so it in effect assumes that the Clackamas voters have to have followed all this stuff, say, oh, well, I can't trust her, so I should trust this other person. Those kinds of things usually favor the incumbent. They usually favor the incumbent. What we don't know is if the county commission race is taking off, because that's where really there's a lot of money and a lot of focus. Especially the revolutionaries, the more conservative revolutionaries turn out, they're going to toss her. Because they'll know what she's done. They'll know that they don't want to trust her. But we just have no sense of how that's going to turn out at this point. And that's where Andrew Miller puts a lot of his money. For some reason, not here in Washington County, he wants to change Clackamas County.
Getting back to Washington County, does the lie about owning a winery have any traction whatsoever?
The lie, like, are you saying Elizabeth Furs doesn't own a winery?
She owns a grape farm, as I understand.
Yeah.
That's not a winery.
Yeah, that's a little bit in the weeds in terms of agricultural production, but
However,
no, I don't think I don't think it has any traction at all. And the reason is Elizabeth Furs' voters are going to be the suburban voters who like to go to the countryside to smell lavender and see grapes. They're not going to be the ag people who say, oh, no, that's what you do. It's a different thing. They're not going to be those kinds of people. So I don't think it's going to make any difference at all in terms of her campaign. There's another one. There we go. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just spend a second talking about Republican issues. They seem sort of old and tired, you know, and it seems like they just play to their own base all the time. And I'm thinking down the road a ways, if they don't start doing something different, you know, they're going to kill themselves off.
Yeah, no, that's a real issue, and it's not just here in Oregon. It's basically the West Coast. So the Republican issues, if you were to take out things like gay marriage, but you can lump that in with social issues, and you were to go back to 1981, so Ronald Reagan's just been elected, it sounds exactly the same. A little bit more libertarian, because the libertarian, oddly enough, in Oregon, led by a former Democrat, Kevin Mannix, kind of changed our conversation about that, and Bill Sizemore did as well. But the issues are pretty much the same, and it's clear that, especially on the West Coast, that's not a set of issues that leads to victories at the statewide level. And yeah, they're going to have to change. But nationally, they've been rejuvenated by the Tea Party conversation. Polling and the candidates on the stump shows us that this is another thing that has pulled the Republican Party further to the right, but not outside of the realm of being electable statewide. If you have an actual Tea Party candidate running for the Senate, that's usually bad news. But it pulls whoever wins to the right, and that serves well in Washington, that serves well back at home. And so that conversation nationally is a successful one for the Republicans. They have been rejuvenated by the Tea Party experience. The West Coast has been really an awful area for the Tea Party. Tea Party really hasn't done much of anything here. And when pushed on it, the early Tea Party people insisted, well, our job is not to get elected. Well, golly, so what are you going to do? Write letters to the editor? Nobody's going to read the paper anymore. Yeah, in the West, it's going to take a real change. This is where doing Vicatia's biography is just fascinating. You know, he's elected in '58. He was running, in fact, the close election where he didn't know if he was going to win or not was '64 when Goldwater was creamed. And so and what happened then? Actually, Vicatia left the House, which went Republican, and that was his first run for the Senate, which stayed Democratic. In fact, for much of his time in the Senate, he was one of 6 or 7 Republicans. So 30 people in the Senate, there's a quorum, and he doesn't have to be there. And so talking to him about this, it's just fascinating to talk to him about the fads in effect and what's happened. He comes back down to it's got to be small government, it's got to be responsible government, it's got to be delivery of services that people want, but know that they have to pay for. really consistent on that. And by the time he became governor, that was a message that really stuck. That's when Proposition 13 in California had just passed. So we're at the beginning of the property tax revolution going on. And so he survived that basically by being true to himself and never having serious competition for re-election. And there's a lot to be said for not having serious competition for re-election. You can be true to yourself, and it reinforces itself. The Republican Party in Oregon has been true to itself and is spectacularly unsuccessful at statewide offices. And it keeps not reforming. We thought Gordon Smith might be leading this, but Gordon Smith, personal reasons, he lost the election, et cetera, Gordon Smith is out of it. And Greg Walton is not going to be stepping into that position. And so that conversation waits. That conversation waits. It's got to happen. We've seen it nationally. We've seen it in Oregon before. Think nationally, when Goldwater's defeated in '64, it was a horrible defeat for the Republicans. And yet, that was Ronald Reagan in 1980. So they had the conversation, they worked it out, they made connections, they did all that kind of stuff. In Oregon, in effect, we're not seeing a center of the party to have those conversations. They're talking to themselves, as you said in your question, and we're not seeing a personality. We're not seeing a Ronald Reagan. We're not seeing even an Alan Alley step up and say, hi, I haven't won yet, but by gosh, I'm close. We had Ron Saxton, who did okay. We had Chris Dudley, who almost won the governorship. So what does Ron Saxton do? He moves. And what does Chris Dudley do? He moves out of state. So the people you would expect to lead that conversation don't stick around. Which is another big change. Another big change. Back in the corner, yeah.
What is it about Lauren Parks that he can't stay out of Oregon politics?
You know, it's funny because when the national media find out what Lauren Parks does, it's fascinating. Well, he sells things that you might use in your bedroom, let's say, occasionally. So he looks at Oregon as a place where his money can make a difference. And it's just lately that he shifted to candidates. Remember, all through the 1990s and the early 2000s, it was ballot measures. It was ballot measures in a big way. And the ballot measures, you know, people argue whether or not Bill Sizemore, you know, was a legitimate player or anything. He absolutely was, because he got more than the number of signatures it takes to get on the ballot. That's the definition of a credible political player, period. And Lauren Parks would say, great, I'm with you, let's move this. Kevin Mannix, let's put anti-crime measures on, and do all these kinds of things. So he sees Oregon as a place to try out his ideas. He had some connection here, he hasn't lived here for a long time, but he sees it as a place to do that. And you know, think Andrew Miller's same thing. I mean, he sits out there with his lumber company in Gaston. He lives in Southwest Portland, basically. But he looks around and says, where can I spend my money where it's going to make a difference? And he's been spectacularly unsuccessful at the state legislative level, but Clackamas County, darn successful. And so Clackamas County can then be a model that will then show other people that you can do this, and more particularly what you need to do once you're elected, then you can go. And this is, you know, all this gets tied up in campaign finance and all those other kinds of things. Remember, in Oregon, we basically have no campaign finance limits. We have a law, which is cool, because you can go onto Orstar and you can see who's given money within hours, basically. But there are no campaign finance limits. One of the big questions that people are now asking nationally, because of Supreme Court decisions on fundraising and super PACs and all that kind of stuff, is, so is it free speech to influence the votes in a district that you don't live in? And if you have national issues in mind, of course. But it raises some interesting questions about, in effect, these policy entrepreneurs who use their money to make choices and try to influence things.
How do you see Cover Oregon affecting both the short-term and the long-term races?
Well, short-term, it's clear that Cover Oregon and the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare all wrapped up in one package. That's the U.S. Senate primary, right there. In terms of going beyond that, it's really hard to see what happens to it, because it's been a punching bag for Republicans and a defend it but wince for Democrats, for about the past year now. And those kinds of issues tend not to have legs beyond about a year. And so in the fall, without a strong presidential race going on, it's hard to see how that's going to play a major role in the fall. Clearly, Kitzhaber, geez, I hope he has more debates than he did 4 years ago. Remember that? He and Dudley both had their dates firm, and they weren't the same dates. And so they basically met once in Eugene, and they did kind of a thing up here in Portland, and that was it. But Kitzhaber's going to have good answers. But beyond that, I don't see that it has a chance of really moving things. For instance, it's not going to be something we're going to see that much in the state legislative races, and they all voted for it. They took a stand on it. So I think that's going to run its course. Interesting to see if Monica Webby wins. One of her things is she's emphatic that Obamacare has failed. Well, we have no idea if it's failed because it's only been going for 4 months. So by the time we get to the fall, if she's the candidate, if she says, by gosh, this has failed, that's another thing that's going to play to the base. But remember, to win, she's got to have the base, she's got to have more than 55, 60% of the unaffiliated, and she's got to bite off a chunk of the Democrats. To win and say that Obamacare has failed is not going to be a winning strategy for her.
Traditionally, it seems to me like conservatives have been very supportive of spending money on highways and roads and things like that. But lately, it seems like conservatives have been opposed to fixing bridges and mass transit and roads and so on. So what's happened?
Well, I would disagree that they're opposed to roads and bridges. I would agree that they're opposed to mass transit. And mass transit, remember, in the Portland area, mass transit means max. And so that's one of our Washington County cities, voting basically, if you're going to do anything like that, you've got to come to the voters. That's Clackamas County saying, don't bring that Portlandization to us, that kind of thing. So Republicans traditionally have liked those kinds of things because they create business. And the business then, that's got Democrats traditionally because then there are union workers who are doing the work, and so everybody's happy. The big thing that we haven't seen as much here, but we've seen a lot in California is, can we as a state afford these kinds of projects? So in California, they just replaced the Bay Bridge, and they had a huge fight over whether or not that was going to happen, even though we've seen it falls down in an earthquake. That's bad. We should replace that. Huge fight over that, and it goes even further. In California, they're rethinking all of their prison policies. Because, yeah, we want to get these people off the street, but boy, it's expensive to keep them off the street. And so Republican issues, this is more of the libertarian kind of thing. We're focusing on, we want a smaller government, we want a less expensive government, and there are certain things that government ought to stay out of. Interesting, when you go back and look at that, Adam Smith, who kind of invented capitalism, said there is a role for government. There are 3 of the roles, but one of them specifically is to build infrastructure. Because it doesn't make sense for an individual to invest to build a port or an entire railroad or those kinds of things. You do that, and then the infrastructure is there, and people can then make their freedom of choice, and goods and services will flow, etc. So in Oregon, we're beginning to see that a bit, but California, it's much, much, much different. Now, if we were in Josephine County or Curry County, throw everything I said out the window, government is simply bad. And if government wants money, it's trying to steal it from me. My favorite story, I grew up in Jackson County, so right next door to many of these things. My grandparents lived in Curry County, so we had to cross Josephine County to get back and forth. But in Josephine County, they had elections for the county commission. One of the people who won election was one of the anti-tax people, firmly. As soon as he was elected and was elected to office, his fellow super conservatives said, okay, you now know where the secret money is, how come you're not telling us? And so that kind of thing just goes on in and on itself. And both of those counties have Beijers on the ballot to basically spend money for jails and things like that. We're going to see what happens on the election tomorrow. I'm not hopeful that they're going to pass anything. So.
Jim, your prediction for the federal U.S. Senate, House Representatives control in 2015?
Yes, so for the U.S. House of Representatives, Republicans keep it. Republicans will probably gain anywhere from 10 to 20 seats. Just because that's the normal pattern. The president's party loses in the middle. Only exceptions to that were FDR in his first term, and oddly enough, Bill Clinton in the middle of impeachment. Go figure. So I think the Republicans continue that. That means Greg Walden continues to be, well, Ron Wyden just became the chair of the Finance Committee, so he's got power now, but Greg Walden continues to be the second most important person in our congressional delegation. In terms of the Senate, you know, it's unclear. It looks to me right now that the Democrats hold it, but they hold it by maybe 1 or 2 seats. But this is still pending what happens in Republican primaries, that kind of thing. And so it could go that the Republicans then win it by a few seats, but it looks like it's going to be really close. It looks like it's going to be really, really, really close. Both sides are kind of pushing to say, oh, you know, for instance, Jeff Merkley, oh, he's vulnerable, so we need to come in there. It's like, well, that's great, but if you're going to do that, then you should have come up with better candidates than these two. And you did. And so there's a lot of the ones that look vulnerable on paper where the candidate's quality just isn't going to be good enough. But right now, it looks like the Democrats hold it, but not by much. But I reserve the right to change that 16 times between now and November.
I just want to tell everybody the federal judge overturned the marriage ban.
Oh, it did happen?
Yeah.
The meeting I was just at Pacific, we have 2 days of meetings for a class that's required of all first-year students when they come in. So we meet for 2 days to figure out what we're going to do and all these things. The person sitting next to me is our new chaplain, a guy named Chuck Curry, who's kind of fun. He's a friend of the Obamas, just, you know, casually. But he was going to have to leave because he's got marriages to perform at 5 o'clock. Everybody's been just ready to go on that. So, yeah.
So a little bit back to the national scene. What about gerrymandering? Because it's pretty heavy, I think, in certain parts of the U.S. So is that going to have a big effect on what happens?
No. Gerrymandering looks like it is the worst thing in the world. And you can find cases in all 435 House seats. You can find cases where it's pretty egregious. And they're fun. Remember, gerrymandering comes from Elbridge Gerry, not Jerry, who was the governor of Connecticut, and it's his name and a salamander. So it's this creature, that's the gerrymander. And you can find, especially when you get down into the south around the Atlanta area and going over towards Texas, there are these salamanders out there. They're just cool looking. One of the most famous is a district that's supposed to be so narrow that if you drive down the freeway and keep both of your doors open, you'll hit every registered voter as you drive down the freeway. But here's the funny thing about the gerrymanders. We haven't seen them make a difference in what would have been predicted if they didn't happen. So they happen, people feel more comfortable with them, off they go. Let's take it from the federal to the state, okay? So in Washington County, regardless of how the districts are drawn, we're still going to be primarily a Democratic county now. The demographics have changed. Here's where gerrymandering and districting becomes something that people give a little too much credit to. In places that are growing quickly, so the West Coast, the South, into Florida, when you draw the district, it actually reflects what your intentions are for the first election and the second election. So now you're basically kind of 2 years, 4 years into the whole 10-year cycle. After that, the population changes so much, it actually doesn't reflect what your intentions were. Because new people have come in, people have shifted, they go all over the place. I was talking on conservative talk radio with somebody about this one time, and one of the people was actually a state legislator. He turned to me and his eyes got big and he said, "You just described my district. It's harder and harder to win election there." It's like, yeah, it's not because the boundaries changed, it's because the people have changed. And that turns out to be a much bigger predictor of what's going to happen than the actual district lines themselves.
I think we have to wrap with
one more. What elected official, throw it out there.
What do you think of the wisdom of abandoning the ballot measure for marriage equality in light of the decision on the court.
So, but the wisdom of abandoning the ballot measure for marriage equality in line with the court decision, I think it's a horrible thing. I think they ought to continue with the ballot measure. I think they ought to put it on the ballot. I think they ought to change Oregon's constitution, not rely on the courts. Here's why. If you've been looking at the media coverage in the past 2 weeks, it's the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. Much of the change in that is not legislative, but it's the courts. And after 60 years, things are going back. Because it relies on a court decision to tell you you ought to integrate, you ought to do whatever. And marriage equality has changed so quickly. 10 years ago, this election is when Oregonians overwhelmingly voted that we would not have same-sex marriage. So 10 years from now, what's it going to be? And to lock it in, you got to lock it in with a ballot measure. You can't depend on the courts. So that's my 2 cents, and they're not listening.
Folks, how about a round of applause for the I'd like to extend a condolence on behalf of Senator Steiner Hayward. She was not able to make it today, and we'll try to get her back as soon as possible. So we convene again in 2 weeks at the Peppermill. We will not meet a week from today because of the holiday. Thanks for being here. See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye. Yay.